Trinity, the dusty gunslinger with a grin as sharp as his draw, saunters into the small, dim-lit tavern. He's hungry, filthy, and far from concerned about appearances. Every eye in the room watches as he takes his seat, including the cook's wary glance and the two bounty hunters with a taste for trouble. The smell of beans fills the room as Trinity settles down, ignoring the bounty hunter's sneers. The cook approaches, eyeing the stranger's ragged look with suspicion, while the bounty hunters size him up, each wondering if he's worth a bounty himself. The cook looked Trinity up and down with a skeptical eye.
You got any money to pay for that meal, stranger?
Trinity chuckled, taking a slow bite of bread and chewing calmly.
Not a dime, but it sure smells good.
One of the bounty hunters sneered, leaning closer.
Look at him, filthy as the dust he dragged in with.
The other bounty hunter laughed.
Might even be worth a few dollars himself. You wanted two, boy.
Trinity shrugged, unbothered.
Only thing I'm wanted for is these beans,
he said, helping himself to another spoonful. The wanted man across the table watched Trinity nervously.
What are you here for, mister?
Trinity wiped his mouth and stood up, his gaze fixed on the man.
You. Let's go.
One of the bounty hunters slammed his hand on the table in anger.
Hey, who do you think you are taking him like that?
The other bounty hunter glared, reaching for his gun.
Yeah, what's your name anyway?
Trinity turned with a glint in his eye.
They call me Trinity,
he replied calmly. The room went silent, and the first bounty hunter's face twisted in shock as he recognized the name. The left hand of the devil, himself. The bounty hunter whispered in disbelief,
Trinity? No, it can't be.
Without another word, Trinity strode out with his prize. The bounty hunters, seething, reached for their guns, and shots rang out. But Trinity was faster, drawing his gun like lightning, and the two men fell before their bullets could even reach him. Trinity holstered his gun with that same casual air, tipped his hat to the waitress, and walked off with his bounty, leaving the cook, waitress, and a pair of fallen bounty hunters in his wake. Trinity passed the sheriff's office with his prize in tow. A commotion caught his attention. 3 men stood outside the building, yelling threats and demands. The sheriff, Bambino, sat leisurely in a chair on the porch, newspaper in hand. From under the brim of his hat, his eyes lazily tracked the men, but his calm demeanor never wavered. Trinity leaned against a nearby post, silently enjoying the show. The 3 men hollered louder, their voices echoing in the quiet street. They wanted their friend released, angry over what they claimed was an unjust arrest. Bambino, unimpressed, sat with his gun resting on his lap, his relaxed posture contrasting sharply with the men's agitation. Trinity watched closely, knowing Bambino wasn't one to be rattled. One of the men shouted, pointing at Bambino.
Sheriff, let our friend go. You've got no right to keep him locked up.
The second man stepped closer, his voice tinged with frustration.
Yeah, he didn't do nothing wrong.
Bambino slowly folded the corner of his newspaper down, looking at the group with a bored expression.
Didn't do nothing, huh? I locked him up for sleeping with another man's wife.
The third man sneered, spitting on the ground.
So what? That ain't a crime worth locking him up for.
Bambino raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly in his chair.
Maybe not to you boys, but to the man with the shotgun who was chasing him down the street. Seemed like a pretty big deal.
The first man growled, his hand twitching near his gun.
Enough of your smart mouth. Let him out, or this'll get ugly.
Bambino sighed, folding his newspaper neatly and setting it aside. He rested his hand on the grip of his gun, his voice calm but sharp.
Ugly's already here, boys. You want to make it worse?
3 men reached for their guns, but Bambino was faster. In the span of a heartbeat, his shots rang out, and all 3 fell where they stood, their weapons barely cleared from their holsters. As Trinity led the wanted man closer, he muttered.
That's Bambino for you. Always efficient.
With a grin, he strolled toward the sheriff's office, curious to see how his brother would react to his unexpected arrival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Trinity and Bambino settled into the sheriff's station. It was an odd sight, the laid-back gunslinger and the gruff, imposing lawman. Trinity leaned against the desk, his curiosity piqued. Bambino sat across from him, arms crossed, his patience already wearing thin. Trinity, ever the joker, wanted answers. How had his brother, a man who ran from the law as often as he ran toward trouble, ended up wearing a badge? Bambino, gruff and no-nonsense, wasn't keen on explaining, but Trinity had a way of getting under his skin. Trinity smirked, tossing his hat onto the desk.
So, Bambino, how's a man like you end up playing sheriff? You always were better at running than enforcing.
Bambino scowled, leaning forward.
2 days after I broke out of the pen, I shot a man who was following me. Turns out, he was the new sheriff.
Trinity laughed, shaking his head.
So, you just decided to step into his boots, huh?
Bambino grunted.
Figured it'd be the perfect cover. While I wait for my men and plan the trip to California, nobody's gonna suspect the sheriff.
Trinity grinned, leaning back in his chair.
Clever. Real clever. But you know, you've got a bit of a temper for this line of work, don't you?
Bambino's voice turned sharp.
You listen to me, Trinity. Don't you mess this up. I've got it all planned out, and you're gonna leave this town as soon as possible. Got it?
Trinity raised his hands in mock surrender.
All right. No need to yell.
Just as the tension between the brothers thickened, the door creaked open, and a weathered man stepped inside. He glanced nervously between the two brothers before focusing on Trinity. The man's face was worn with worry, his voice quiet but urgent. He began to fill Trinity in on the Major and his men, a group with too much power and too little conscience. They had been harassing the local farmers, making life unbearable for anyone who stood in their way. The man cleared his throat.
You new here, stranger?
Trinity glanced at Bambino, who didn't even look up.
You could say that? What's on your mind?
The man hesitated, then leaned closer.
It's the Major's men. They're running this town like it's theirs, harassing the farmers, taking what they want. If anyone speaks up, they're lucky to make it out alive.
Trinity raised an eyebrow.
And the sheriff here's letting it happen?
Bambino shot Trinity a glare.
I don't get paid to babysit every farmer in this town.
The man looked between the two, his face pleading.
Somebody's got to do something. We can't live like this anymore.
Trinity listened carefully, his easy demeanor masking the flicker of determination growing inside him. Bambino, on the other hand, didn't seem moved. But Trinity knew his brother well enough to sense the wheels turning. Trouble was brewing, and the brothers were about to find themselves right in the middle of it. The saloon buzzed with the clink of glasses and murmurs of conversation, but the atmosphere shifted when Bambino walked in. The sheriff wasn't there for drinks or cards. He had a warning to deliver. Leaning casually against a post, Bambino fixed his steely gaze on the Major, who sat at a table surrounded by his men. Trinity, hanging back near the door, watched silently, ready to step in if needed. The Major sat in the center of the room, his smug expression illuminated by the flickering lamplight. His men laughed and jeered, emboldened by their leader's arrogance. But the laughter faded as Bambino's deep, gravelly voice cut through the room like a knife. Bambino crossed his arms, his voice low but firm.
Hey, Major, I'm getting real tired of your men harassing the farmers. If it doesn't stop, I'll take their guns myself.
The Major leaned back in his chair, smirking.
Why don't you go ahead and try, Sheriff?
One of the Major's men, a wiry fellow with a crooked grin, stood and sneered.
Yeah, Sheriff. What are you going to do about it?
Before the man could say another word, Bambino stepped forward and hammered his fist into the man's head. The impact sent the man sprawling back into his chair, unconscious. The saloon went silent, save for the creak of the man's chair as it rocked back and forth. Trinity smirked from the shadows, clearly entertained. The Major didn't flinch, his smirk unwavering.
You know, Sheriff, I don't like the way you've been running this town.
Bambino straightened, his voice sharp. This is your last warning, for you and your chicken rustlers. Stay in line, or I'll put you there myself. The Major's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Bambino's message was clear, and the room stayed quiet as the sheriff turned and left the saloon, Trinity trailing close behind. The two brothers walked through the darkened streets, the saloon's dim light fading behind them. Back at the sheriff's office, Bambino's frustration boiled over, but Trinity's calm, easy demeanor only added to the tension. Inside the office, Bambino paced back and forth, grumbling about the trouble the Major and his men were stirring up. Trinity leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if he had all the time in the world. Bambino stopped and glared at Trinity.
If those men cause any more trouble, the Rangers might come sniffing around, and if that happens, I won't have time to meet up with my men and get to California.
Trinity raised an eyebrow.
So, what's your plan? Let the Major keep running the show?
Bambino grunted.
I can't do this alone, and I don't trust anyone else in this godforsaken town.
Trinity smirked.
Sounds like a personal problem, Bambino. Why drag me into it?
Bambino sighed, rubbing the back of his neck.
Listen, I'm offering you a deal. Help me handle the Major and his men, and I'll make it worth your while. You'll get food, a place to stay, and maybe even a cut of whatever I get when this is over.
Trinity tilted his chair back, considering.
You're bribing me with beans and a roof? Not exactly a high offer.
Bambino shot him a sharp look.
You know me, Trinity. When I promise something, I deliver. What do you say?
Trinity leaned forward, his grin widening.
All right, Bambino. Let's see if we can teach those chicken rustlers a thing or two.
The tension in the room eased as the brothers came to an understanding. Trouble was brewing in the town, and for better or worse, the two of them would face it together. The morning sun cast its golden light over the dusty plain where the Mormons had begun to settle. Their wagons formed a makeshift camp, a small but determined community carving out a piece of land to call home. But peace was fleeting in a land ruled by power, and trouble came riding in the form of the Major and his men. The Major, dressed sharply and exuding authority, approached the camp on horseback, his men flanking him. Tobias, the leader of the group, stepped forward to meet him. Behind Tobias, the other Mormons stood silently, their faces tense but resolute. The conversation began politely enough, but the Major's thinly veiled threats soon painted a darker picture. The Major reined in his horse, looking down at Tobias with a cold smile.
You're trespassing, old man. This land's not for you or your wagons. It's for my horses.
Tobias looked up at him, his voice steady but respectful.
We'll only need a small part of the land. Your horses won't be troubled by our presence.
The Major leaned forward in his saddle, his smile fading.
I don't like to repeat myself, so let me make it clear. I don't want you here. Pack up your things and go.
Tobias met his gaze, calm but unwavering.
We mean no harm. We only want a chance to live in peace. Surely there's enough room for all of us.
The Major straightened, his eyes narrowing.
Peace is a luxury you can't afford around here.
As the Major turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder and saw a new threat emerging from the horizon, a group of bandits riding hard toward the Mormon camp. Their intentions were clear. Trouble was coming. From a distance, the Major watched as the bandits descended on the camp, their shouts cutting through the air like a blade. The Mormons tried to remain calm, but the bandits began to harass them, demanding food and supplies. The tension in the camp rose with each passing moment. The bandits, scruffy and loud, dismounted near the wagons, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. They circled the camp like vultures, picking out their targets. The Mormons stood firm, but fear flickered in their eyes as the bandits pushed harder, tipping over barrels and rummaging through supplies. One of the bandits shouted,
"We're hungry. You've got food, don't you?"
Another sneered, grabbing at a sack of grain.
Yeah, don't be stingy now. We ain't asking. We're taking.
Tobias stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace.
Please, we're willing to share what we have, but we ask you to leave us in peace.
The bandit laughed, shoving Tobias back.
Oh, we'll leave when we're good and ready, old man.
From his vantage point, the Major watched the chaos unfold, his expression unreadable. The bandit's actions didn't seem to bother him, perhaps because they were doing his dirty work for him. But the Mormons weren't ready to back down, even as the pressure mounted. Trinity leaned casually against the post outside the general store, his sharp eyes catching the scene unfolding nearby. A man and his 2 daughters, one of them strikingly beautiful, stood at the entrance, their faces tense with frustration. Inside, 2 of the Major's men loomed over the storekeeper, making it clear the family wasn't welcome to shop there. The father pleaded with the storekeeper, but the Major's men stood in the way, their smirks dripping with arrogance. Trinity watched for a moment, his expression unreadable, before stepping forward. With his usual laid-back charm, he escorted the family inside, a quiet force of reassurance in the tense atmosphere. Inside the store, Trinity's presence shifted the dynamic. The Major's men glanced at him, sizing him up, but their confidence faltered when he decided to make a point. With a casual flick of his hand, Trinity demonstrated the speed of his draw, the motion so fast it seemed almost invisible. The room went silent, the air heavy with tension. The 2 men froze, their earlier bravado replaced by disbelief and a flicker of fear. Trinity's gun was already back in its holster before they could fully comprehend what had happened. The father and his daughters quickly gathered their supplies and left, their gratitude evident in their hurried nods toward Trinity. As the family disappeared down the street, the tension inside the store snapped. The Major's men, humiliated and angry, turned their frustration on Trinity. It wasn't long before words turned to fists, and the store became the battleground for a rough and tumble brawl. The fight was chaotic, a whirlwind of fists and crashes as Trinity held his ground. Shelves toppled, cans rolled across the floor, and glass shattered as the Major's men struggled to overpower him. But Trinity's strength and skill proved too much. He moved with a casual precision, each punch deliberate, each block effortless. By the end, the Major's men lay sprawled on the floor, groaning in defeat. Trinity brushed the dust off his jacket, stepped over their prone forms, and tipped his hat to the storekeeper before walking out as calmly as he had entered. The saloon was alive with the hum of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the shuffle of cards. At the center of it all sat the Major, his usual air of superiority bolstered by the presence of his men around him. The door creaked open, and in walked Trinity, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. A faint smirk played on his lips, and a sheriff's star gleamed on his chest, catching the flicker of the lantern light. Without a word, Trinity made his way to the Major's table. The men at the surrounding tables paused their games to watch, their murmurs fading into silence. Trinity pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning back casually, his hat tilted just enough to cast a shadow over his eyes. Trinity spoke with an air of calm authority, telling the Major that his harassment of the farmers needed to stop.
You've been making life hard for them, and I'm here to tell you it ends now.
He said, his voice low but firm.
Otherwise, I'll hit you where it hurts.
The Major leaned back in his chair, amusement dancing in his eyes.
And where's that, Sheriff?
He asked mockingly. Trinity's smirk widened.
You really want to find out?
One of the Major's men sneered from the side.
What are you gonna do? Wave that little tin star around?
The words barely left his mouth when Trinity turned sharply, his hand on his holster. A moment later, the man behind Trinity collapsed to the floor, his gun clattering uselessly beside him. The saloon erupted in gasps. From the upstairs balcony, another of the Major's men aimed his gun at Trinity. Without even looking up, Trinity drew and fired, sending the second man crashing into the railing before falling onto the saloon floor. The room went dead silent except for the creak of Trinity's chair as he leaned forward. The Major's smug grin faded, his eyes narrowing. Trinity's message had been delivered loud and clear. Without another word, Trinity stood, tipped his hat to the stunned crowd, and walked out of the saloon as if nothing had happened. When Bambino heard about what happened, his frustration boiled over. Back at the sheriff's office, his booming voice filled the room as he paced back and forth, clearly angry about Trinity's impulsive actions. Bambino glared at Trinity, his voice sharp with irritation.
What in the hell were you thinking? Confronting the Major like that? You want the whole town coming after us?
Trinity leaned against the desk, unbothered.
I thought I'd speed things along. You can only dance around a problem for so long, Bambino.
Bambino threw up his hands.
Speed things along? You shot 2 of his men. Now the Major's gonna bring his whole gang down on us.
Trinity smirked.
Then it's a good thing we're quick.
A few nights later, Trinity found himself back in the same saloon. He leaned against the bar, his hat pulled low as he nursed a drink. From across the room, the sound of laughter caught his attention. One of the Major's men sat at a table with his cronies, his voice loud and mocking as he spoke. Trinity stiffened when he caught the man's crude remarks about his mother. The insults weren't something Trinity could ignore. Trinity set his glass down carefully, his movements deliberate. The room seemed to sense the tension as he stepped away from the bar, his steps measured as he approached the table. The Major's men stopped laughing, their gazes snapping to Trinity as he stood before them. Trinity's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it.
You've got a lot to say about my mother. Let's see if you can back that up.
The man sneered, rising slowly from his chair.
You don't scare me, Sheriff. You're just a tin star with a big mouth.
Before Trinity could respond, the saloon doors swung open with a loud creak. Bambino stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. He took one look at the scene and shook his head. Bambino muttered, his voice gruff.
You just can't stay out of trouble, can you?
Trinity smirked without turning.
Wouldn't be me if I did.
The man growled, pointing at Bambino.
You want to step in too, Sheriff? I'll take both of you.
Bambino's expression didn't change as he stepped closer.
You're welcome to try.
The saloon erupted into chaos as the brawl broke out. Trinity moved with speed and precision, dodging punches and delivering sharp, calculated strikes. Bambino, on the other hand, used his brute strength, tossing men into tables and smashing chairs like they were made of paper. The Major's men tried to gang up on the brothers, but they were no match. Trinity and Bambino worked seamlessly, their movements almost synchronized as they cleared the room of threats. When the dust settled, the saloon was in shambles, and the Major's men lay groaning on the floor. Bambino looked at Trinity, shaking his head in exasperation.
You're gonna be the death of me? You know that?
Trinity shrugged, a playful grin on his face.
Maybe. But you've got to admit, that was a good time.
Bambino sighed heavily.
Let's get out of here before you decide to start round 2.
As the two brothers stepped out into the cool night air, the tension between them eased. For all their differences, there was one thing they could agree on. When trouble came knocking, they'd always have each other's backs. As the settlers gathered to join the brothers, the peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of galloping hooves. A group of bandits stormed into the settlement, their laughter and shouts cutting through the calm. They demanded food and wine, their voices loud and mocking. The bandits dismounted roughly, knocking over barrels and crates. One of them grabbed a settler by the collar, slapping him hard and laughing. Another began tipping over dishes on the table, sneering as he reached for the stew pot. One of the bandits barked,
"Where's the wine? And don't tell me you don't have any."
The settlers stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. Tobias pleaded softly,
Please, we'll share what we can. Just don't hurt anyone.
Trinity leaned over to Bambino, his tone dry.
Well, they're friendly, aren't they?
Bambino grunted.
Not for long.
The bandit leader turned his attention to Bambino, sneering as he stepped closer. He slapped the hat off a settler standing nearby, laughing as the man stumbled back. That was all it took for Bambino to act. With one massive swing, Bambino slapped the bandit leader across the face, sending him crashing to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the dirt. The remaining bandits froze, their bravado melting as they realized what they were up against. One of the bandits stammered.
You didn't have to hit him that hard.
Trinity smirked, resting a hand on his belt.
He was asking for it.
Panic overtook the group as they scrambled to mount their horses. The bandits fled the settlement, their leader still sprawled on the ground. The settlers watched in stunned silence before cheers erupted, their gratitude pouring out in waves. Tobias approached the brothers, shaking his head with a smile as he thanked them. Trinity, always the joker, simply winked and reached for a piece of bread. Tobias chuckled.
You two have a way of making an impression.
Bambino shrugged.
We were just hungry.
Trinity grinned.
Speaking of which, let's eat before anyone else shows up.
With the bandits gone and the settlers' spirits lifted, the brothers joined the meal, a rare moment of peace shared under the warm afternoon sun. Back in town, the major, furious with the brothers, hired 2 gunslingers to deal with them. Word spread quickly, but Trinity, ever eager for a good laugh, decided to welcome them personally. Trinity strolled into the general store, where the gunslingers lounged, their pistols prominently displayed. The townsfolk outside heard muffled voices, followed by a series of gunshots. Moments later, the store doors burst open. The 2 hired guns ran out into the street, stripped to their underwear, their faces red with humiliation. Trinity emerged behind them, smirking as he dusted off his hands, drawing laughter from the gathered crowd. Trinity called after them, his voice light.
Next time, tell the Major he'll need better help.
Bambino had one goal in mind: to get Trinity out of town before he caused more trouble. Taking no chances, he led his brother across the river, his tone firm as he insisted that Trinity leave and not look back. Bambino's voice was gruff.
Go. The farther you are from town, the less trouble you'll bring.
Trinity smirked, his tone light.
You're really going to miss me, aren't you?
Bambino shot him a glare.
Not a chance. Now move.
As Trinity rode away, he made a detour to the Mormon settlement to say goodbye. Tobias welcomed him warmly, but the farewell turned bittersweet. At the creek, Trinity found Sarah and Judith swimming, and what began as a simple goodbye turned into a playful moment as he joined them in the water. The sisters laughed and splashed, pulling Trinity into their carefree joy. For a brief moment, the weight of the town and its troubles felt distant. Despite Bambino's orders, Trinity decided to stay with the settlers for a day or 2. Watching Tobias and his people struggle under the shadow of the Major, he couldn't walk away. Instead, he encouraged Tobias to stand up and fight back. Trinity leaned on a fence post, his voice steady.
Tobias, you can't let the Major push you around forever. It's time to stand your ground.
Tobias hesitated, his tone wary.
We're peaceful people, Trinity. Fighting isn't in our nature.
Trinity nodded, but his voice was firm.
Sometimes you have to fight for peace.
As Trinity spoke with Tobias, two rough-looking riders approached the settlement. They asked around for Bambino, their purpose clear. Recognizing them as Bambino's men, Trinity decided to take them to him himself. The ride back to Bambino was tense, but Trinity kept his usual calm demeanor. When they arrived, Bambino greeted his men with a nod and quickly got to business. Bambino's tone was curt as he addressed his men.
The job's simple. We're stealing the Major's horses, and we're doing it clean. No mess, no mistakes.
One of the men nodded.
Got it, boss.
Trinity, leaning against a tree, smirked.
Horses, huh? Sounds like a lot of work.
Bambino glanced at him, unimpressed.
Stick to what you're good at, Trinity. Causing trouble?
Later that night, Trinity decided it was time to pitch his idea, a way to deal with the Major and settle things for good. Trinity's tone softened, though there was a rare seriousness in his words.
Help me get rid of the Major, Bambino. After that, I'll marry Sarah and Judith, forget my past, and we'll go our separate ways.
Bambino raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with dry humor.
Both of them? That's ambitious, even for you.
Trinity grinned.
A man's got to aim high.
Bambino chuckled, shaking his head.
You're crazy, but maybe it's the right kind of crazy?
With their plans aligned and an uneasy understanding between them, the brothers prepared for what lay ahead. Trouble was coming, but for now they faced it together. Elsewhere, the Major met with the bandits, led by Mescal. His plan was simple: drive the Mormons off the land in exchange for 20 stallions. It was a deal born out of greed and power, and the bandits were eager to accept. Meanwhile, Trinity and Bambino sat with the Mormons, listening to Tobias. The settlers were ready to defend themselves, but only if necessary. Trinity and Bambino, along with Bambino's men, decided to help them prepare. Tobias spoke firmly.
We don't want to fight, but we'll defend ourselves if we must.
Trinity nodded.
Good. Then it's time we show you how.
Under the brothers' guidance, the Mormons practiced fist-fighting while Bambino's men joined in. The peaceful settlers, unaccustomed to violence, slowly gained confidence as they learned to defend their land. During the training, Trinity's sharp eyes caught a figure in the distance, watching from the shadows. Suspicious, he quietly instructed one of Bambino's men to catch the spy. Bambino gestured toward the tree line.
See that? Someone's watching us. Go bring him here.
The spy was quickly captured and brought to Bambino. Under pressure, he revealed the Major's plan: to use the bandits to force the Mormons off the land in exchange for stallions. Later, as the brothers stood apart from the group, Trinity confronted Bambino. He already knew what was on his brother's mind. Trinity smirked.
I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if you should take Mescal's place and grab those 20 stallions for yourself.
Bambino didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. Two brothers, two sides of the fight. But where do Trinity and Bambino truly stand? With the settlers or with the spoils? That's the question that only their next move can answer. That evening, the Major's men gathered by the stables, expecting Mescal's bandits to arrive and collect the promised 20 horses. Unbeknownst to them, Trinity and Bambino had a plan of their own. Disguised as Mexicans, they slipped into the stables under the cover of darkness, ready to steal the prized stallions for themselves. Moving swiftly and quietly, the brothers rounded up the horses, their disguises and confidence fooling the guards. By the time the Major's men realized something was wrong, Trinity and Bambino were already galloping away into the night, leading the stolen horses to safety. While the brothers carried out their heist, the sheriff, whose badge Bambino had taken, arrived at the sheriff's office. Determined to catch Bambino, he questioned Jonathan, the caretaker, about his whereabouts. The sheriff with his sharp tone.
Where's Bambino? I know he's here.
Jonathan shook his head, feigning innocence.
You're late, Sheriff. He's been gone for weeks, probably across the border by now.
The next morning, Trinity and Bambino returned to the settlers, the stolen horses hidden and the Mormons none the wiser. But their brief moment of triumph was interrupted when Jonathan arrived, breathless with urgent news. Jonathan found Bambino outside the camp, pulling him aside to speak in hushed tones. Trinity, nearby, leaned in just enough to catch the conversation. Jonathan's voice was hurried.
The sheriff's in town, Bambino. He's looking for you, and he's not alone. Oh, and the major. He's furious. He knows you took his horses, and he's planning something big.
Bambino grunted, his expression darkening.
Great. Just what we needed?
Trinity smirked, nudging his brother.
Sounds like we've got a busy day ahead.
With the sheriff closing in and the major planning his revenge, the brothers find themselves trapped between two storms. Can they stay one step ahead, or is this the end of their schemes? As Trinity and Bambino discussed their next steps with the settlers, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. Mescal, the major, and their men arrived, armed and ready for a fight. But the brothers and the settlers were one step ahead, hiding inside wagons scattered across the camp. The major dismounted, leaning casually against one of the wagons. What he didn't know was that Trinity and Bambino were inside, waiting. From a small hole in the wagon, the barrel of a gun poked out, pressing lightly against the back of the major's head. Trinity's calm voice came from the wagon.
Tell your boys to drop their guns. Now.
The major froze, his voice shaking.
Put them down, boys. Put down your guns.
One of his men frowned, confused.
Why? What's going on?
Bambino growled from inside the wagon, his voice low and threatening.
Do what he says, or the major's not making it out of here.
The men hesitated, but when they saw the gun barrel emerge, they quickly dropped their weapons.
All right,
One muttered. Before the major's men could react further, the settlers and the brothers burst out from their hiding spots, guns blazing. Shots echoed across the camp as the bandits scrambled for cover, but it was no use. The settlers stood their ground, and soon fists replaced gunfire as Trinity, Bambino, and the settlers fought bravely, taking down the bandits one by one. With the major's men defeated, Trinity and Bambino sent him off to Nebraska, much to his protest. The settlers cheered, their land finally safe, but the brothers' victory was short-lived. As Bambino prepared to celebrate, he noticed something odd about the horses they had stolen from the major. The settlers had branded them all. Bambino exploded.
They branded the horses? You mean we stole horses? For them?
Trinity grinned, leaning casually against the fence.
Looks like we're not in the horse business anymore.
Bambino muttered curses under his breath as he and his men rode off, furious.
I'm done with you, Trinity. Don't follow me this time.
Trinity found himself at a crossroads. On one side, a life with Sarah and Judith. On the other, the path his brother had taken. He hesitated for a moment, but ultimately decided. As the sheriff, who had been looking for Bambino, arrived in a wagon, Trinity pointed him in the direction Bambino had gone. Without waiting, Trinity followed as well, slipping into his familiar laziness. The sheriff asked,
"Where'd he go?"
Trinity yawned, pointing lazily.
That way, but don't expect him to wait.
The sheriff hurried off, and Trinity hitched himself to his horse's travois, lying back with a grin as his brother's trail stretched out ahead of him. Some things never change. Two brothers, one endless journey. Can Bambino ever escape Trinity? Probably not. And maybe, just maybe, he doesn't really want to.